nature of these reciprocal tariffs, that all President Trump is asking is for countries to take theirs off.
What we're asking for is let's have 30 days extension of our current CR, and let's negotiate on a good faith bipartisan basis. That's not unreasonable.
It's our job to make the American people understand that these cuts to government and these attacks on government are an attack on them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, NATO in the Oval Office. President Trump sits down with the Secretary General at a pivotal time as the United States pushes for a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia, while Russian President Vladimir Putin says he has, quote, reservations about the deal. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, it's worth noting, is in Moscow for talks. Plus, looming shutdown and more market sell-off. Senate Republicans need Democratic support to move a continuing resolution to keep the government funded forward. Question, can both sides come to an agreement before midnight Friday? We start tonight with Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes at the White House. Nancy, break down the most important developments in the conversation that went on in the Oval Office with reporters present between the Secretary General of NATO and the President.
Well, President Trump said there with the Secretary General of NATO sitting beside him that he was hoping to get a better sense very soon of where exactly Putin stands when it comes to a Ukraine ceasefire and whether they can, in fact, broker a deal. He said that they are in the process of discussing land that would be kept and land that would be lost. And he said that these negotiations, of course, are very complicated. You're sort of creating the edge of a country, as he put it, as you try to delineate how much territory Russia would potentially be able to keep and where that territory would be. Ruta, for his part, praised President Trump and said that in just a few short weeks, Trump has been able to successfully pressure European nations to increase their defense spending, which is something that the NATO Secretary General applauded.
And Nancy, earlier today on CNBC, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked about market volatility and if the tariffs, on again, off again, are playing a role. Let's listen.
We're focused on the real economy. Can we create an environment where there are long-term gains in the market and long-term gains for the American people? Having been in the markets for 35 years, I know the market is prone to big unwinds.
The Treasury Secretary talked about an unwind in the market, also kind of a detox phase, a transition phase. The White House appears to be reaching for lots of different words to describe what's happening.
Right, and there's a new word on the horizon, Major, and that is a correction, because with the losses today, the S&P now is officially in a correction mode. But what White House officials have been arguing is that eventually the markets are going to get accustomed to some of these threats that President Trump issues when it comes to tariffs, and that the markets won't respond as dramatically as they did today in response to these new 200% tariffs he threatened to place on alcohol from France in retaliation for some new EU tariffs, which were in turn in retaliation for some steel and aluminum tariffs that he imposed on them. The very definition of a trade war. White House officials say eventually the markets will learn to bake that in, that eventually other countries will learn not to mess with the president, or they are going to get slapped with major new tariffs themselves. But for today, at least, we saw the Dow tumble another almost 1.5%. So clearly the markets haven't gotten used to it yet, Major.
And Nancy, very quickly, I want to ask you about something that happened this morning. The White House pulled the nomination of Dave Weldon as the head of the CDC. What are they saying about that?
Well, they said that they pulled his nomination because it was clear that he didn't have the votes, which is a pretty blunt admission for a White House. Usually they'll try to talk around it when something like this happens. In this case, they really couldn't, because his confirmation hearing was about to get underway in the Senate when they pulled the nomination. Weldon, who is a former member of Congress, had expressed deep skepticism in the past about vaccines and had argued that perhaps they caused autism, which was something that troubled enough Republican senators, and it only takes a handful, that they had gone directly to the White House to express those concerns. And the White House could do the math. They could see that they probably were not going to have the votes, so they pulled the plug.
Nancy Cordes, thank you very much. I want to bring in our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Margaret Brennan, also the moderator of Face the Nation. Margaret, you have two areas of expertise. I want to plumb both of them. First, foreign policy. How do you and how should the country evaluate what Putin has said so far about reservations, wanting to meet directly with Trump? How do we read all this?
Well, look what he wore when he went to the Kursk region and to that battle. You don't normally see Vladimir Putin anywhere near any kind of combat, unlike the president of Ukraine, who goes out to try to rally his troops. Vladimir Putin has remained very safely ensconced in other areas. He put on fatigues. He's sending this message out there on the cusp of what could be a major Russian victory if they succeed in pushing out Ukrainian forces from this area of Kursk in particular. But both that, sort of staging
the visuals,
then what we heard from Yuri Ushakov, the foreign policy advisor to Vladimir Putin, who said to the state broadcaster this morning that they're not interested in this ceasefire, is setting the table and setting expectations low. Ushakov said he spoke to Mike Waltz, national security advisor to the president of the United States, and said before the envoy, Steve Witkoff, landed in Moscow, that this wasn't a promising offer, what the Trump administration in Ukraine had hammered out just days ago in Saudi Arabia. This call for immediate short-term ceasefire and lifting of sharing of intelligence to Ukraine. And so we're sort of left waiting for what comes out of this Witkoff one-on-one. What's different? Why did he go through with that visit if he knew that the table was set for failure at the get-go?
And why, with Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, sitting right next to him, did the president sound so optimistic?
Optimistic, he did.
He did, and he was talking about we've had advanced discussions behind the scenes about land, power plants, the edge of a new country. Is he misreading this, or is he trying to push something onto the table that's not quite there yet? I know it's hard to know.
It's hard. It's impossible to know. But both sides are doing some maneuvering here. Now, arguably, does Steve Witkoff say, I'm the negotiator, I'm the closer, I'm the guy who does the real estate deals, therefore I can close this thing when I get on the ground and it's worth going through? Vladimir Putin came out and said he wants to personally speak with Donald Trump. And so that is where things start to get pushed back to. So it's hard to say things have failed completely if the two leaders get on the phone call together. But in these circumstances where Vladimir Putin has been at this for so long, it is interesting to see that there isn't any expert in Russian politics, intelligence surrounding this team. Steve Witkoff is a real estate developer and very good at closing deals, but Vladimir Putin is very good at playing people, and that raises a lot of questions.
In your previous life, you covered the markets aggressively, carefully. You've seen cyclical ups and downs. The Dow down 1.3% today, the NASDAQ down 1.1%, S&P down 1.39%, continuing a trend line of volatility and sell-offs for about 2 weeks solid now. How do you interpret this?
Markets are a forward-looking pricing
bet on the future
mechanism.
Right.
They're trying to price the future. And they're saying things look pretty darn uncertain here, not just with the headlines that seem to be changing hour by hour, but what is Donald Trump really saying? And I think this is something major. When you put your finger on something that I think we're all missing, lawmakers missed it, diplomats missed it, the markets mispriced it. The president of the United States means that when he puts tariffs at the heart of his economic policy. He is arguing, and he did it again with Rutte in the Oval Office, this idea of unplugging America from the global supply chain and unplugging it from the global markets and going back to a period of time in the late 1800s where there were high tariffs at a time when there wasn't a global supply chain, at a time when there was child labor in this country, at a time where it was cheap labor for a lot of reasons, and there were restrictions that went in and made it much more expensive to make things in America, right? There are a lot of factors, is my point. But he goes back to this period of time and talks about it and says he wants to replicate it, essentially, by charging everyone who tries to sell anything to an American consumer essentially a tax that arguably your seller would pass along to you. So I think everyone likes buying American. But look at the tag of where your items were made.
Right. And what the price implications are of all of this. And that's one of the things that the market is pricing and selling off on.
Exactly. Trying to figure out what it's going to cost for those businesses to conduct their businesses and what it's going to be like to try to sell into a consumer base facing this uncertainty right now.
Two areas of expertise. Margaret Brennan, thanks for sharing both.
Major.
I appreciate it. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says he's just not concerned, really, about the market's recent struggles. Our economic panel will take a look at the state of the economy and investments evaluation next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is trying to reassure the public and the markets about the state of the economy. He went on CNBC, which is where, generally speaking, Republican and Democratic appointed Treasury Secretaries go if they're trying to reassure markets. Let's listen.
I'm not concerned about a little bit of volatility over 3 weeks, because if you look over the long term, the reason stocks are a safe and great investment is because you're looking over the long term.
From on all this, I want to bring in Dave Wessel and Sarah McGregor. Dave is a senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings. Sarah is the managing editor of the national desk at Bloomberg News. It's great to have you both with us. So, David and Sarah, I'll take Dave first and then Sarah. So, this week, there have been some underlying positive signs for the economy. Inflation a little bit lower. The first-time unemployment, jobless claims a little bit lower than expectations. Under normal circumstances, those would be up signs for the market, right?
That's right. Look, I think the markets are terrified.
Terrified.
It's almost as if before this week or the last couple of weeks, the markets said, Trump's going to do the stuff we like, deregulate,
right,
cut taxes, and he's not going to do the stuff we don't like on-again, off-again tariffs. And they've discovered that turns out when Donald Trump said he loves tariffs, he means it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also very difficult. You get whipsawed. Like now, the latest is we're going to have a 200% tariff on Europe unless they do this.
On alcohol products that come out of Europe.
Exactly. So look, it's a kind of a cliche to say the markets don't like uncertainty, and we have a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
But if there was ever a time where uncertainty, what are the policies of the United States going to be next week? Are these bargaining tactics, or is he really trying to break up unglobalize the economy?
Right.
No one's quite sure.
And Sarah, whenever an administration finds itself in any economically uncomfortable conversation, it always falls back on the fundamentals and the long term. And the fundamentals are generally positive. But if the market can't read the fundamentals as clearly as the White House wants it to because it's distracted by these other things, it would seem like there's either a communication or a policy problem or possibly a little bit of both.
Absolutely. I thought it was really interesting today. We had Bessent's predecessor, Steven Mnuchin, who was Treasury Secretary during Trump's first term, and of course oversaw the economy then, saw the tariffs at that time. And he thought that, the markets, that a lot of people had sort of not taken Trump seriously when he threatened tariffs to begin with. And he had carried them out in his first term, and they should have sort of priced this in. But in his point of view, he's in the, no recession on the horizon camp. He's singing from the same hymn book as the Trump administration. But he said that the markets and this correction that we're seeing now, 5-10%, in his view, is normal, that the markets had been supercharged with the AI and sort of tech boom. And so, again, we just sort of see that point of view right now that, telling everyone remain calm, don't panic. But at the same time, as you just mentioned, Major, we see the economic fundamentals. Is the market's going to take the economy down with it? There's a lot of questions to ask. And again, April 2nd, we're going to see more tariffs, according to Trump. He's not going to back down. So what does that mean?
And Sarah, I want to follow up on something you mentioned, because I think it's important in the context, at least of the NASDAQ, the tech-heavy NASDAQ. There was this sense at the end of 2024 that AI investments would provide almost limitless gains, that all the efficiencies and things and market share were almost limitless. And there's been a recalibration of that. Is that part of this conversation that's separate entirely from tariffs?
We really haven't seen the Trump administration, except when their hand was forced, referring to the markets. Of course, we saw the Treasury Secretary today try and calm people down. Trump had really tried to use markets in his first term because they just seemed to go up, up, up the whole time as sort of a metric of how well he was doing. And we see them sort of trying to restore a little calm today in the markets, but I think they're really trying to stay away from that conversation. And it's interesting that you mentioned tech, because of course, tech, including Elon, are some of Trump's sort of biggest supporters right now. And we looked at some data that looked at, even if you just look at some of the tech leaders and some of the company leaders that were at Trump's inauguration, they've been wiped out in the hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of their valuations right now in the companies that they own and run. So, they might be able to close their eyes for a little bit and hope that we can ride through through this. They may have the luxury, of course, with wealthy people can definitely maybe play out the market a little bit better. But people who are looking at their 401ks right now on the other side of things may be questioning the strategy.
And Dave, I want to pick up on that 401k mutual fund. Tens of millions of Americans are involved in either 401ks or mutual funds, short-term or long-term. And if you are in the sort of $200,000 range, you might have lost $7,000 to $10,000 in the last month. If you're in the $500,000 range, which a lot of Americans are planning for their futures, your losses could be $15,000 to $20,000. Do those things trickle down to the economy? Do they change people's behavior?
I don't think they changed people's behavior very much. After all, most of us who have 401ks think this is money we're saving for retirement.
Right.
And I'll bet a lot of people are not looking at their accounts. But what's going on, it's this air of chaos. So even if you're not a big stock market investor, you have to say, why is the S&P down 10% in the last few days? The consumer confidence surveys are worrisome.
Shallowing, yes.
When you hear the M&A, I was talking to an investment banker who said that he had expected January, February to see a lot of mergers and acquisition because he thought the Trump administration would be more open, less aggressive on antitrust. He's seeing nothing. So if everybody says, maybe I'll just hold off for a minute, everybody does that at once, that's how you get a real serious slowdown in growth and maybe a recession. And I think that's why the recession forecasts have come up.
You said M&A, that's merger and acquisition. I think this is W&S, wait and see.
Absolutely.
A wait and see economy.
Absolutely.
Dave Wessel, Sarah McGregor, thank you very much, both of you.
You're welcome.
California judge has ordered federal agencies to reinstate thousands of terminated workers in the federal workforce who were laid off. They were on probationary status. The U.S. District Judge from San Francisco ruled that neither the Office of Personnel Management nor its acting director had the authority to carry out last month's firings. He noted that mass layoffs are allowed under federal law, but come with several requirements not yet met by the Trump administration. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt criticized the ruling and said the Trump administration will immediately appeal. Legislating as the minority party, it's harder than it looks. House Democrats are planning their path forward, such as it is, at their annual legislative retreat. We're live from there next, right here on America Decides.
We recognize these are brutal and scary times, but here's our message to the American people. The House Democrats stand with you.
That was House Minority Whip Catherine Clark speaking in Leesburg, Virginia today. House Democrats are there. They do this every year, spend 3 days to look at their legislative agenda and their methodology to try to move forward with whatever that agenda is. Hunter Woodall is covering this for us, coming to us from Leesburg, Virginia. Hunter, always good to see you. So give the audience a readout, the temperature gauge. What's the sense there?
Major, most of this conference so far is happening behind closed doors. But I will say to the Democrats I've talked to, the sense here is obviously there was this big sense that they wanted to look at what happened in 2024 and try and improve, try and come back from the issues that they've seen. Now, how exactly they do that still remains that big question. And you look at the list of speakers and, obviously this House Democratic Conference, especially after voting against that GOP funding bill ahead of this government shutdown deadline on Friday, there's still a lot of tension here, and there's a lot of questions about how exactly they fight back against Donald Trump and congressional Republicans.
Is there a fear, Hunter, that you've detected at all about Democrats, House or Senate, because most Americans aren't going to distinguish between the two, being blamed if there is a shutdown?
That's the big question, Major, is how much, Democrats obviously, in this whole process, it's been clear, congressional Republicans were going to need Democrat support in some way, especially in the Senate, given the Senate's, filibuster threshold for most legislation. But when I talked to congressional Republicans, they made that big point, hey, we have a trifecta, we think we can do this alone. But the whole time, they were going to need Democrat support. So I think House Democrats, they keep saying, hey, we don't want to shut the government down. They obviously, though, just voted against, in the House, the big plan to actually fund the government ahead of this deadline. That's that big question of, okay, will they actually follow through on this? And how are they going to feel they had a role in shutting down the government come Friday?
What's the sense of Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, and his role in helping House Democrats come out of the wilderness, if there is one that they're in?
Major, when I talk to Democrats, not just here, in Congress, but also Democrats, within the DNC, the Democratic National Committee at large, the big sense has been, Hakeem Jeffries is the leader of the Democratic Party right now. He is the face of the Democratic Party, ahead of the 2028 presidential election, obviously ahead of the 2026 midterms. Though the thing is, when you look at who's on the speaker list for this Democratic, House conference here, you have three governors: Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Governor Beshear of Kentucky, and Governor Whitmer of Michigan. Most of the resistance to Donald Trump and what Republicans are doing in Washington is coming from Democratic governors. And that's a big change from obviously what we saw in 2017 when Donald Trump and Republicans were in power.
Hunter Woodall, thank you very, very much. Turning to immigration now, CBS News reports that President Trump is planning to use a law from 1798. He talked about this on the campaign trail to help carry out deportations to Guantanamo Bay. That part he didn't necessarily reference. I want to bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camila Montoya Galvez, who joins us from New York. What do we know?
Hi, Major. Well, we know that according to U.S. officials, President Trump is preparing to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 as early as tomorrow to fast-track the deportation of certain migrants who are in the country illegally. We are told by U.S. officials that the targeted group is expected to be suspected members of the Tren de Aragua prison gang, which is comprised mostly of Venezuelan nationals. That obviously has been a focal point of the president's sweeping crackdown on illegal immigration. And we are told that U.S. officials, Major, have already made internal plans to send suspected members of this gang from Venezuela to Guantanamo Bay to hold them there and then deport them under the Alien Enemies Act, which, of course, is a law that was really just passed by Congress and signed into law 22 years after the Declaration of Independence. And it has been rarely invoked. One of the few times was in World War II when the government at the time used it to surveil and detain immigrants from Japan, Germany, and Italy who were in the U.S. And this would allow the government, Major, importantly, to summarily detain and deport migrants subject to the law without any of the due process protections outlined in U.S. immigration law, because they would be treated as enemy aliens. So this is just the latest attempt by the administration to really test the boundaries and really the firewalls in U.S. law to achieve its immigration goals.
Because the classification under this law would mean you are enemies of the state, enemies in almost a condition of war, vastly expanding the federal powers to deny due process. Do I have that right?
That's right. They would be considered wartime enemies of the state.
Also, you've gotten readouts from those in Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement about capacity for those who have been deported or are awaiting deportation, are being detained. What is it?
Well, ICE, as you know, Major, has been charged with carrying out the largest deportation operation in American history, and it has ramped up immigration arrests across cities in the U.S. So far, since the president took office, the agency has arrested about 33,000 immigrants across the country. But ICE is quickly running out of space to hold the detainees it has arrested. Some people have been released because of these bed space constraints, and now the agency detention space is at 120% capacity. And so ICE, Major, as we speak, is turning to other federal agencies like the Department of Defense, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and others to build sufficient and additional detention space. But they're facing the same operational challenges that, as you know, had bedeviled Republican and Democratic administrations on this issue.
Camila Montoya Galvez, always with the specifics and the perspective. Thank you very much. We have some unfortunate news to share. Democratic Congressman Raul Grijalva has died from complications related to his treatment for lung cancer. The Arizona Democrats' office says he died this morning. Grijalva had represented Arizona in Congress since 2003. His office released a statement saying, in part, quote, driven by his community values and spirit, he worked tirelessly and accomplished so much for Arizona and for the country. Serving Southern Arizona was the honor of Raul M. Grijalva's life, unquote. He was 77 years old. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. President Trump will deliver remarks at the Department of Justice tomorrow focused on, quote, law and order. I'll have a little bit more on that in a second. I want to bring in our reporter panel, Dave Weigel, who covers politics for Semaphore, and Deepa Shivaram, White House correspondent for NPR. So, law and order. Dave, Deepa, you know this is a long-standing chestnut for Republicans. How do I know that? I collect old magazines. I have a magazine in my office, Life magazine, dated 1968. There was a presidential election that year. The entire cover story focused on Republicans and law and order. So it's a long-standing thing. It's going to be a little bit different tomorrow because it's not just going to be that. It's going to be about Trump saying, I was badgered, harassed by the old Justice Department. I'm changing it. But there are those who fear already, Dave, that there is a revenge component to those changes.
Well, there is an unprecedented level of executive interference in law firms. You saw this with the executive order punishing Perkins Coie, which they're already in court. They're arguing, I think persuasively, that
the law firm.
Yes, the law firm, that they've immediately been harmed by this, and that this is not unexpected necessarily with Donald Trump. He often, as a private citizen, would file lawsuits that didn't look like they had a chance, but were enough to tie somebody up and harm their reputation. This is the force of the federal government going into that. And this is just 2 months in. A lot of people around the country, environmental organizations, law firms, anyone who crossed him or crossed MAGA in any way is looking at the next 3+ years and saying we might have to defend ourselves against DOJ.
I mean, this is just following up on something that Trump said himself on the campaign, right? He was going to go after his political enemies, people who have wronged him. He's already started in the DOJ, going after people, moving them around in the department, demoting them, getting rid of them in the DOJ, people who worked on the January 6th cases, anyone who investigated him at all
Even
for
if that
the
was
number
their
of
job.
cases that
Not
he
that they
had.
set it in motion. They were just asked to do it as part of their job.
Absolutely. And these are, civil servants. These are lawyers who work on behalf of the U.S. government who are being penalized by this president because he perceives them as going after him and personally attacking him. There's been a long-standing tradition, I would say, of, a separation between the White House and the Department of Justice, letting the DOJ do their jobs, not in this administration.
And it will even be unusual for the president to be there.
Right.
Yes, that too.
to put the political aura of the White House right inside the Justice Department.
Yeah, I'm glad we don't have to put money in a jar whenever we say unprecedented, because that's going to keep happening. But you set it up well. That there are people who thought they would have careers in law enforcement,
federal law enforcement, right?
And they're leaving for a number of reasons. These reasons, demotions. This is happening in D.C. too, where people who were part of the January 6th prosecutions have been demoted, even if they won those cases. People have had their cases they won. Those included basically erased by pardons, and other cases they're working on erased by pardons. So you're seeing already a little bit of a brain drain from people who made their careers in multiple administrations, Republicans, Democrats, people with no politics who expected a certain sort of professionalism from these. They're leaving and I bring up D.C. because Ed Martin, the acting U.S. attorney, does not have their level of competence, has already struck out in a number of his projects, and is working with less talent on purpose because he wants some of those people out of the office.
Deepa, shifting our attention, you wrote about Elon Musk at the White House. That's not brand new. It's still new, but it's not brand new. What was brand new is turning the South Lawn into a Tesla mini dealership.
Yeah, add another $1 to the unprecedented jar on that one.
And one thing I want to do for context, so Tesla is still the most valuable auto company in the world, but in the heyday of post-election euphoria about Elon and Tesla and the incoming Trump administration, on December 17th, Tesla traded at $479.86. Today it closed at $240.68. JP Morgan this morning wrote, "We struggle to think of anything analogous in the history of the auto industry," meaning losing 48% of market cap in 3 months.
I mean, and this is to put it into further context, as Tesla sales are down in the U.S., they're down in China, in Australia, across Europe. This is a major problem for this company and for Elon Musk, who is a close ally of Donald Trump.
And it's brand identification, identification suffering.
That is not necessarily the president of the United States' problem. And so, again, to turn the White House South Lawn into a Tesla dealership of sorts, there were several cars brought in for the president to peruse. I reached out to the White House.
And the president extolling the virtues of them, saying he's going to buy one at market price.
The White House said this was a personal decision for the president, a personal purchase for the president. Fine. The president can go buy a car with the money that the president has. But, when you put something at the White House like this, that involves the White House press pool, right? Giving this event coverage. That involves, free publicity for the Tesla brand and for Elon Musk, who remains the CEO.
Dave Weigel, a couple of things, as we inevitably do, because we have no other choice as political reporters and statisticians. Pete Buttigieg said he's not going to run for the Senate in Michigan. Governor Walz of Minnesota is heading to Iowa. I think those things are not unrelated. They're both presidential oriented to 2028.
Yeah, well, I talked to Walz's office today ahead of this tour, and they were more confident they could go to Iowa because it's not in the Democratic calendar. They knew that this would get that attention. But he was quiet after the election, started to speak out. And he, unlike Kamala Harris, has been very quiet, has given no indication she wants to run again, just not ruled it out, has done some mea culpas for how they ran the campaign, has criticized how they handled it. Would that feed into him running again? I'm not sure. They don't want that impression yet, but they are trying to tap into what Bernie Sanders, who's absolutely not running and has said he won't, already found, that he held rallies over the last few weeks in swing districts, I shouldn't say swing states, and had bigger crowds than they expected. And they always say we weren't expecting this crowd, but he was getting 8,000 people in a suburb of Michigan where he couldn't get that big of a crowd when he ran for president. And Democrats, any ambitious Democrats saying, I'm at least going to go out and see what the enthusiasm is. Maybe it's a wave washing me in. Maybe it's just a wave that anyone could ride.
And Deepak, real quickly, Pete Buttigieg's like, why would I bog myself down with a Senate race when I can look and orient myself to 2028?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm so not ready to talk about 2028 yet.
Oh,
but
I
here
sympathize.
we are.
I so very sympathize.
And I will just add into the mix, like this is happening as Gavin Newsome is getting, interviewed
Very
by
podcasty.
Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk. And there's just a whole range of things happening with Democrats. I don't think any of it, if you were an average Democratic voter, are you looking at any of these possibilities being like, wow, I have a lot of faith.
Wasn't on any Democrats bingo card in October, I can tell you that. Deepa Shivaram and Dave Weigel, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for hanging out.
Thank you.
Over 100 people were arrested today at Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue in New York City. This was the scene as hundreds of protesters gathered to show support for former Columbia University graduate student and activist Mahmoud Khalil. He is currently detained by federal immigration agents in Louisiana and faces potential deportation. His lawyers are trying to block that. The protest was organized by the group The Jewish Voice for Peace. Some protesters can be seen holding signs that read, "Fight Nazis, not students. Free Mahmoud, free Palestine, and you can't deport a movement." The head of the EPA announced sweeping actions that will roll back more than 30 environmental regulations. Up next, what Administrator Lee Zeldin is calling, quote, the most consequential day of deregulation in American history. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has drastically shifted the United States' efforts to combat climate change, and he said so himself. He announced a series of moves to roll back dozens of environmental regulations. Zeldin wrote in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "We are driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion and ushering in America's golden age." I want to bring in former EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. Gina also served as White House National Climate Advisor to President Biden. Gina, you and I have known each other a long time. I know this is your life's work. Some of my audience will say, of course, she's going to hate everything that Trump and Lee Zeldin do. So, to the best of your ability, dispassionately describe what happened yesterday and what effect it will have on existing environmental regulations.
Well, Major Garrett, thank you for having me. I'll try to do my best to be dispassionate. But as you said, it's really hard for me. You know, the announcement that EPA made and the administrator made is really the most disastrous day, really, in EPA history. You know, EPA was created in 1970, and I was around, and maybe you were then as well, but it was under Richard Nixon. And the mission was to protect health in our environment. And I see nothing in the announcement yesterday that actually mentions either of those things. It seems that there's now a change in the mission of EPA, according to the administrator, that is really shifting us towards a golden age of pollution. And it really will be at the expense of our ability to breathe clean air and drink clean water. So that announcement was not one that I would welcome. And it's one where I know you mentioned about deregulation, and that's the words he used. Look, this is supposed to be a reconsideration of fundamental rules that EPA has been relying on, some of them since 2009. That's how far back this reaches. He cannot, through a reconsideration process, deregulate today. He has to go through that process, which often takes a good long period of time. But my fear is that, like other things happening in this administration, they won't be following the rule of law as much as they'll be following their own whims about how they interpret it. And so it's a challenging time for EPA, and I think, frankly, for all of us who really want to maintain our health and well-being and address the challenge of climate change in a way that's going to be effective to continue to grow our economy and advance clean energy.
Gina, he said, that is to say Lee Zeldin in that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, we are protecting the environment not by shutting down energy production, but by making it cleaner and more efficient. That's a quote. How do you evaluate that? Cleaner and more efficient.
It would be great if it were more efficient. We look for efficiencies. I just think that he doesn't understand how these rules come about and why. Fundamentally, this is not about benefiting fossil fuels. This is about advancing the interests of Americans everywhere, that they have healthier environment, they have a cleaner water, they have an ability to live lives that are longer and more robust. That's EPA's mission. So if he's interested in relooking at these rules, if he does it well and there's opportunities to advance these rules in a smarter and more efficient way, I'm all for that. In fact, EPA looks for that all the time because the goal is to get us healthier and protect our environment, not at the expense of industry, but in collaboration with industry and others so that you can advance it in the most cost-effective way. We've been doing that since 1970. He's just got to get with the picture and understand that it's not about picking and choosing your favorite rules that your friends want to see eliminated. It's about what he promised to do as administrator of EPA, stand up and apply the law effectively, maintain the mission of that agency, which is a very wholesome and needed mission.
And Gina, what is your response when you see him write, that is to say Lee Zeldin, about driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of gives a good sense that maybe he's not looking at following the law in rules like the endangerment finding, which went all the way in 2009 to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court stood up then and continues to stand up and say that climate change is real, greenhouse gas emissions endanger our health and well-being, and we have to take care of that and continue to nurture a path forward that will keep us all protected. And apparently that doesn't seem to be part of his agenda. So it's a little bit disconcerting. And it makes me wonder whether he thinks that a reconsideration of things like the endangerment finding or the Clean Power Plan that actually is getting mercury out of the air, or the mercury and the MATS rule, mercury and air toxic standard, which is getting mercury out of the air, and the Clean Power Plan, which is reducing CO2 emissions from power plants. If he thinks that he can stop that now and actually eliminate those protections, I'm sure there's going to be legal action taken. But the challenge for all of us is, in the meantime, he might just shut off the ability of us to actually move forward and have the kind of democratic process that we're supposed to have to protect our interests.
Gina McCarthy, thank you very much. Before becoming President Trump's right-hand man in Washington, Elon Musk built his career largely on the West Coast. We'll dig into his California and tech background. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Elon Musk may be relatively new to Washington as a power broker, as someone who wields a chainsaw and talks about relentlessly cutting the size of the federal government workforce. But he has long been a fixture, not only in Silicon Valley, but across the entire state of California. Emmy Anderson joins me now. She is the California tech editor for Politico. Emma, talk to our audience about Elon Musk's long history in California, his departure from California, and where things stand now.
Sure, and thank you so much. we're seeing what we're seeing in how Musk is approaching Washington is very familiar in Silicon Valley. This sort of fail fast approach, seeing what breaks, trying new things. That's something that is quite common in the tech world, trying to figure out, how to make changes within a company. We saw how Musk did that with Tesla, for example, looking at each component of how you make a car and try things differently. And then when he took over Twitter, making big changes there and then bringing people back. So it's certainly interesting to see that approach now being translated in Washington.
And Emma, he has a rather large profile in the conversation about the future of artificial intelligence. California's legislature is going to debate again regulating artificial intelligence. Elon Musk in the past has weighed in on that. First question, is the California law, should it ever emerge, going to be something that could set a national standard on this? That's why it's important outside the borders of California. And to what effect will Musk's advocacy or opposition have on that debate?
Sure. So there was a major bill last year in the state legislature that Elon Musk backed. It was basically would have subjected large AI models to safety testing. But ultimately, it had a huge pushback from other people in the tech world, and including leading Democrats in Congress like Nancy Pelosi, who argued it would stifle innovation, would be too restrictive. And ultimately, Gavin Newsome did veto the bill. So it is now has sort of reemerged in a new form, a bit of a scaled back form, focused more on whistleblower protections, among other things. So we're still watching to see what will happen with that bill. Newsome, when he did veto the previous bill, set up an expert group of AI academics to weigh in on, how should we approach AI safety. So that's another thing that we're going to be watching is what comes out of that group that Newsome set up. How will that influence this new bill that's being proposed and other legislation that the California state legislature comes up with? There are a number of other bills about AI, but a lot of folks here in California are watching what comes out ultimately of those findings to determine the shape of legislation here and then potentially other states.
You mentioned Governor Gavin Newsome. In the aftermath of the 2024 election, he's decided to launch his own podcast. He recently had Steve Bannon on that, and they talked about Elon Musk. Let's give a quick listen.
He wants to be the first trillionaire in the world. I mean, what's his end game here?
Well, you guys, you created him, Governor. I mean, you
By
guys.
By the way, in many respects, California did. It was our regulatory process and our subsidies to create this market. You're 100% right. I think you're right about that.
That from the This Is Gavin Newsome podcast. So, California helped create Elon Musk. They've since become estranged. What does that mean for things?
Sure. I mean, I guess one thing to note, though, is his companies still have a big presence here, right? Twitter and Tesla and SpaceX, even his smaller company Neuralink and his AI company. So that is one important thing, I guess, to note is there is still this huge presence of Musk's companies. But I do think it's interesting in that interview as well with Newsome and Bannon is kind of a place where they do find some kind of common skepticism a little bit of Elon Musk. Both have had, different interactions with him, and Newsome has had some, kind of an interesting relationship with Musk. Obviously, Tesla is part of this EV push that California and Newsome have sort of been really strong about. But also there's been clashes like about the AI safety bill and about other labor disputes in California as well.
Emma Anderson, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. That does it for today. I'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.